Saying that AI tech is popular at the moment would be an understatement. There are loads of services popping up to give us AI chatbots and image generators and all sorts of other things. I want to show you how easy it is to connect to one of these services direct from our game. So today I'm going to be working through the process to connect an application made in GameMaker to ChatGPT. Let's get stuck in. Great, we've got our fresh empty project. There's some files at the side that we're not going to need, so I'm just going to tidy these up, delete them. We're not going to be needing them. We're just going to need the one room and an object. So just move this into the top of the level directory. There we go, and create a new object. This one object is going to do everything for us, so I'm just going to call it Object Connect. There we go. And let's place that into the room so we know it starts when we run the program. We're going to need to connect to the OpenAI servers, and systems change when they're on the internet. So an important part of this for me is actually show you my thought process and where to get the relevant information. And the first step is we're going to need to look at the OpenAI manual. And I'm hoping this is going to show you the kind of thing to look out for when using other online services. Because in the future, you may want to make a game that does something crazy, like downloads real-time weather information to use in-game, or gets scores from a database, or place names, or character names, or currency conversions. When two online systems want to talk and share data, a way they can do this is via their API, and we want to make sure we can make HTTP requests between our program and the OpenAI servers. How this is going to work is our program is going to dispatch a message to the OpenAI servers. This is called the request. This request is sent to a URL just like you'd normally use to get a web page, and will have included in it our credentials to authenticate who we are, and also any information about what we want from the server. At some point in the future, hopefully only a second or two later, we'll get a reply from the server, and this is called the response. So this first part of the manual talks about how we prove to the OpenAI servers that our program is linked to our account, and I'll go over that in more detail shortly. I'm not sure what this organisation part is, however it seems like you can have many accounts linked to one organisation, which we might need later. Now this part has given us some better examples with some data, so it's starting to look closer to what we want. Models. List and describe the various models available in the API. So this is where the manual breaks down each of the different types of requests we can send them and what it will return. Let's actually have a read of what models we can use. The models request will allow us to ask the system which datasets are available to use. However, I just want to use their latest and best one, which is the Text DaVinci 003. So let's go back, and its page has scrolled up, so that's the models, that's the request to list the models, retrieve the models, and completions. Given a prompt, the model will return one or more predicted completions. This is the URL we want to send our messages to. This is sometimes called the endpoint. And this request looks like it's going to be the one we want to use. Here they've given us a very nice example of what they expect us to send them. Here are the arguments we can send them to change the response we get. And then in the middle, they actually break down what each of those arguments do. So prompt, this is going to be the focal point of what we send, because this is the actual question or text we're going to ask ChatGPT. In the example, they send off, say this is a test, but we can put in, what's a good name for a wizard, or give me a name for a town in the woods. Other data we can optionally send them. We have suffix, which just looks like some text it appends to the end. Max tokens determines the length of what comes back. Temperature looks like the quality of what was returned, same as top P. End, stream, log probs, but I don't want to go through all these. And that's the end of the options for completions request and the start of the next type called edits. But I'm now certain we want to do a completions request. So I'm going to sign up for an account and I'll cut the video to after I've done that. Okay, I've created an account and I'm all signed in, so let's go about actually making a completions request. I don't know if it's pronounced curl or CURL, but I know it's a way we can send a HTTP message to a server in a similar way a browser does. For this, we need to know the URL of where the message is going, and it tells me it needs two things in the header of this message: content type and an authorization API key. These are the two lines that start -H. The line that starts -d is the data for this message, which are all those arguments I listed in the middle of the page, so this will be the crux of the payload we're dispatching. Let's start by getting an API key we can use. If you haven't heard this phrase before, it's basically like a username and password all wrapped into one. It's a long combination of letters and numbers which the server will generate and will be unique to this account. These must be kept secret because anyone that has this can use your account, so going forwards I'm going to be covering mine with a big red box. So from now on, if you see this red box, just imagine a very long password is hidden under it. Oh, also, once I close this box, you can't ever get this password back, so I'm going to paste it somewhere safe that I can get to in the future. Now that we have our account set up and we have our API key, let's go back to our project and get something actually started. I have my object that will run all the code, so let's give it a create event and put our code in there. We already know that our program will need to send a HTTP request, and GameMaker already has a handy function called HTTP request. I don't remember exactly how it works, so I'm just going to quickly check the manual because that will have all the information we need in it. Right, let's make this a bit bigger so we can see what we're doing. There we go. HTTP request. With this function, you can create a HTTP header request. Perfect. And it says it can be used on RESTful APIs. This is exactly what we're going to want to use because the OpenAPI server is using a REST API. This lets us know when we get a returned message, it's going to trigger a HTTP async event, and all the data we'll need will be in a variable called async load. It's expecting us to supply 4 arguments when we use this function. However, it's got an example here, so I'm just going to grab that whole thing and paste that over. We don't need that anymore, so replace that. There we go. Let's get a little bit more room to work, so I'm going to collapse the sidebars with F12 and make this bigger. Let's see what we have. Host is the URL or endpoint in the OpenAI manual. Connection, just going to keep that as it is. Same with content length and cache control. Authorization, that's definitely one we know we need to change. It was in the manual with some specs on how they wanted it formatted. Except, I've got no idea what this next one is, so I'm just going to leave that. User agent. I won't change this, but it's an interesting one. Normally this would contain the browser that is being used, like Opera or Firefox, and in addition to this, it could say other information like if it's a mobile browser or what version of the browser is being used. And then the server might change the response it gives us, like if it's a small screen, it might give us lower resolution images, or a mobile version of the website, or if it knows it's an old browser with bugs, it could change the response to exclude features that don't work on that browser. However, all that stuff is more relevant for when you're receiving HTML code in the returned message, but we're going to be getting JSON formatted response. Content type, if I remember, this is another one where they gave us the exact thing they wanted us to send them. Accept encoding, that one wasn't mentioned. Accept language, that's not mentioned. Cookie, I'm not going to change that either. And then the last one's data, so this is where we're just going to put all of those optional arguments that were listed in the manual. Let's start with host then, and I'm just going to copy them over from the manual. Making sure these are just the same, but I just want the endpoint URL. Paste it in. Connection, I'm not going to change that. Content length, keeping that the same. Cache control, said I wasn't going to change that. Content type, they definitely said they needed something for that. So we want it to say application/JSON. Grab that and place that here. So the order of these doesn't actually matter, but I've jumped over the authorization step. So let's fill that in, and we need to include our API key as part of this one. I'm trying to decide here how is best to store my secret API key so it's not on the screen all the time, because that's going to make it hard to edit this video having to cover it with a red box. What I think I'll do is store it in its own script file as a variable, and then I can close it so it's just not visible. It doesn't really matter what we call this script. Just clean out the default code because I don't want to put it in a function. Actually, let's call this file macros. I can use the macro keyword as I know the API key isn't going to change while the program is running, so this just makes it like a constant. Cool, I think that will be fine, so I'm just going to close this window. For the authorization header, I want to make sure I put it in exactly the format they have in the manual. So I'm just going to go through these, making sure it's all identical on both, same capitalization, same blank spaces. In the example here, it says basic, but on the OpenAI manual, it says bearer. So I'm going to swap that over. And then for the last bit here, I just want the API key that I've got saved in that variable. Again, just doing another pass here just to make sure it's all the same as it says in the documentation. Okay, so those are all the headers copied over now. Let's get onto the data, which is the more juicy bit. Let's start by first clearing out this example data. The reason this data part is a little more tricky is we're going to want to be able to easily change this data and add more values to it. But also, at the same time, I just want to get the most simple test working so I know our program can talk to their servers. Oh yeah, this is going to be a little more complex than I was expecting because it's got line breaks in it and double quotes, so I can't just pass it across as a string like I was hoping. I'm wondering if, just to be quick, I can replace all these quotes and if that's still valid JSON. Again, I just want to get something valid working so I can test the connection. And the last thing to do, I just need to actually put in the URL to where we want to dispatch this request to. This all kind of looks like how I expect now, so I'm just wondering, how do I check this is actually working? I should probably get it to post a message into the output console when this code is run, just to help with debugging. Also, HTTP request is going to return an ID that I can use to match it to the response, so I should print that out as well. That's everything I'm going to need for dispatching the message from my end. Now I need some code to handle what happens when I receive the response. Like the manual mentioned, HTTP request works by dispatching the message now, and many frames later I'll get a callback that returns all the information the ChatGPT servers have returned. This response will be in the event called async HTTP, and all of the data that is returned to us will be in a variable called async load. This is a DS map that contains all of the returned data and some metadata about the response as well. For now, I just want to dump out everything that's in that DS map into the debug console. That will just help us validate that everything is as expected and there are no problems. To output everything from the DS map, I'm going to loop through it using the DS map find first to put my cursor on the very first bit of information, and then use that way we can run through it and output everything it contains. You will occasionally see me press F4 to bring up this snippets menu, which just helps me insert code faster because I'm too lazy to type it out. So we've got the key for the first element in the DS map, and a loop that will go around for every element inside that DS map. DS map find next will move us to the next element and tell us what the key is for it. So before I do that, I just want to output the value that goes with that key. For this, I'm just going to use show debug message to post it in the output console. So I want to output a value inside async load, which has the ID that matches our key variable. And that question mark is used as a shortcut to tell GameMaker that I'm trying to access something inside a DS map. This code now all looks valid. Actually, just before I compile, let's open the output log so we can see what is happening better. Cool, so let's give this a compile now. Right, we've got an error message right off the bat, and it's telling us that in the create event, so when we're dispatching the request, I had a variable that was not defined on the line where I'm sending my API key. So this is likely to be a problem with how I'm passing my API key onto this line. Let's remind myself with how I saved it in this script file. And it's pretty obvious now I can see it. I need to have double quotes around it. This should work now. Let's give it another compile and see if we get any further this time. So we actually have a window up. Let's see what it was posting in the output log. Right, I know it's a little hard to see, but it says in async event, so let's pull that up. And actually, just before that, it does say request sent, and then the ID, so that's those two. I can see a 400 here, So I'm going to assume this is an error code. It's going to use the standard HTTP error code, so anything that starts with a 4 means we got a response from the OpenAI servers, but they don't like what we sent them for some reason. This is actually a good sign for me because it shows that some data from our application actually made its way from our computer, was processed by their servers, and the response got successfully returned back to us. Ideally, we're looking to get a response code 200, because anything in the 200 range means it was a successful request that the server understood. Anything in the 500 range means something has gone wrong our end and it didn't even find a server to talk to. What I'm going to try first is just removing some of these additional headings. They weren't in the documentation, so I wonder if they're needed at all. The only 3 I'm going to leave are going to be host, authorization, and content type. Let's see what happens now when we compile this time. Okay, we get the exact same error, so I'm wondering if there's something wrong with the JSON that we're sending in the data. I probably should have done this from the start, but if I remember correctly, GameMaker has a function to turn a struct into valid JSON, and that would help give me more confidence to know that what I'm dispatching is correct. I'm going to start a new variable called underscore data, which is probably bad naming, but this is going to be a struct containing all that previous data, and it's probably cleaner just to pull it from the website again rather than using the one that I edited and changed the quotes on. And now I've got all that, I'm just going to put it back into the original variable that was just called data, but I'm going to wrap it in a function that will turn it into a JSON formatted string. I can't remember the exact name of the function, but I know if I start typing it I'll get some suggestions. And JSON stringify looks like the one I want. So let's put the underscore version in that, and then we can get rid of the original one that we had. I also want to check that that's got the right thing in it, so let's also output that with the other debug messages. Give it another compile. And that disappointingly looks the same. Actually, it's slightly different. Before it had some spammy messages about an IE friendly page. We can check the data is as we expect. The only difference I can see here that these are being converted into floats when the documentation expects them to be integers, so without the decimal point at the end. I'm not sure how fussy the API is, but just in case, I think it's possible to force them to be an int by wrapping them in int64, and we'll see if that helps. Let's wrap it around both of them, give it a compile and see if that's changed anything. So I'm hoping here in the output log to see a code 200 or some other text from the servers. Okay, that's a shame that seemed not to fix things. However, at least I know the data I'm dispatching is absolutely identical to the one used in the example. Right, I'm just going to go through this and make sure I haven't made any silly mistakes. I haven't pasted something across wrong. Although I have just noticed we're doing a DS map create, but we don't have its partner, the DS map destroy. So there'd be a small memory leak here. However, that's not causing the problem. So I just want to destroy the one called map. I'm pleased I found this memory leak, but it's not actually going to stop us getting a sensible reply. I'm wondering about max tokens and temperature at the moment, because I know the least about what those do, so let's just check the manual to make sure they don't have a particular range, or maybe their use has changed since the example data was written, so I just want to familiarise myself better with them. Both of them are optional, and they've got defaults, so I could just flat remove them from the code. I think first I'm just going to change the value to something different. Let's just make both of them slightly higher for now. And give that a compile. I'm still getting error code 400, so I'm wondering if it's even getting to the part with the data, or if there's a problem earlier on. I was checking to see if the endpoint URL was typed out the same on line 4 and line 18, but now I'm wondering why I even need to include that information twice. Feels like a bit of a long shot, but let's comment out the header version because it should really know that by the time it gets to the server. Oh, Shockingly, that actually seems to have fixed it. Right, there's a lot to go through with what has been returned. However, this is the main block of information, so let's put that in a notepad so we can see it a bit better. Let's zoom in a bit, and then I'm going to put in some of my own line breaks just to make it easier to read. This probably starts off with some unique ID for this communication. That massive number there, starting 16, looks like a timestamp. Then it has the name of the model we requested, and this must be the data. It's got an array that has information about the data, and also some weird line breaks. I'm unsure why it starts off with a bunch of /n/n, but that might make sense later on. I mean, I know those are used to indicate that there should be a new line there. I just don't understand why the sentence would start with 2 of them. And then this bit at the end just seems to be how many tokens it used to generate this response. Great, so we've got something working already. Now that we've got some form of intelligent response from their servers, I think a good next step is just to make it a little easier to see the response we're getting back from them. Let's start with a new variable called display screen, and I'm just going to display whatever text I put in there onto the screen. Let's just start it off with the string loading. This just means that I haven't received anything from their servers, but I have dispatched a message. What I want to do now is just isolate the answer that is returned. So we want to get the message, "This is indeed a test," into our own variable, so we can do cool stuff with it. The first step to do this is just to get the data from the response. I don't need the 200 return code or the URL of where it came from. I just want that long JSON string. So with all those messages I'm getting in the output log, let's just only see the result one. And then let's just put that entire JSON string into our new variable. I'm going to create a new draw event to display this onto the screen. This is going to look pretty ugly, but I'm just going to have large white text on the black background so it's really easy to read. That's the color set. Now I need to set the font. I don't actually have any fonts in this project yet, so I'm going to have to create one. I'm fine with it being Arial font. Let's just give it a sensible name. And let's make it a little bit bigger so it's easy to read. Let's copy the font name so I've got it for the future. I don't want that displayed. Let's just close that window. Paste the font name in here. I want the text to be aligned to the top left corner, so let's just set that now. That's its horizontal alignment, and now do the vertical alignment. Great, let's actually draw the text now. Let's put it 50 pixels away from the top left corner. Whoops, I've still got that in my paste buffer. Forgot to name the variable, there we go. Put that there. Let's give it a compile and it should display the text for us. There we go, loading, wait for something to come back. Ah, we've got a response, but it hasn't actually changed the text, so let's go see what's going wrong. Ah, I see. That's an easy mistake to make. When I get the returned data and loop around it, I have the function to step forward through the data inside of the if statement. So it's never actually advancing forwards to get to the next data. And here we go. That actually fixed it. Next thing I see, it's all on one line. Let's give it some line breaks in it. We just put ext here to turn on word wrap. And I'm going to put -1 to use the default line height for this font. And I'm going to say the width can't be more than 500 pixels. So let's give that a compile. Right, this is slightly annoying. The word wrap will only put breaks in at allowed places, like when there's a space between words, but you can see the JSON is just a long, solid block of text. Just to keep things easy, I'm going to cut out only the text part because I don't actually need to display any of this metadata like the finish reason. So let's go back to this bit where I'm populating display string. Okay, so what I want to do now is take all that lovely JSON data that was returned by the server and break it down into something that is more usable to me, because it's just a big long string at the moment, but I need it into some variables I can reference. I'm actually going to speed through this part where I go through the manual trying to remind myself of how it works. Turns out the function name I was looking for was JSON parse. I knew it was there somewhere. I'm expecting to see a whole bunch of the return data on the screen now, but okay, what we actually have is just the word undefined. This does at least tell me I'm probably pointing to the wrong part of the returned data struct or the DS map. I know this text at the bottom is likely to be very small to read. However, that choices array does look like where I'm pointing, and it all looks like it's spelt correctly. I can see the problem now, and it's really obvious now that I can see it, but I'm accessing it as if the data type was a DS map. However, at this point it's already been converted into a struct, so I can actually access it with just .choices. I'm still not sure why it always seems to contain a few blank lines. However, I'm starting to think that it's just the nature of how these AI systems work, and the model behind it is just giving a higher rating to responses that start with new lines because that's what it's seen in its dataset. Anyway, the next thing I can see that we have are these square brackets around the whole thing. So normally that would just mean this section is repeated a number of times. However, for us there's only one, so let's just display the first one. Give it a compile. It doesn't look much different, but at least the data is in a better shape now. And let's also remove this other junk we don't need, so we're just left with the raw returned answer. It's in a struct at this point, so I can just put dot and then the name of the key that I want to access, which, yep, that it is called text. Let's give it a compile and we should just see the replied answer now. This is indeed a test. Brilliant. Now that we have a better handle on the answer that is returned, let's put a bit of work into improving how we interact with the question we dispatch. I'm going to create a new variable called question to ask, and let's just pre-fill that with what is a good idea for a game? And question mark, there we go. While this doesn't look like an important change, I'm just wanting to make it easier to interface with the request at the moment. And giving it a compile, even though I'm fairly sure it will work, because actually I'm just interested to see what kind of response we get back from this. A game where you play as a detective trying to solve a mystery, you'd have to investigate clues, interview suspects and piece together... Okay, so it's cut off the end, but I'm fairly sure that's what these max tokens are for, so let's make that number much bigger. 300 should do the trick. And actually, I should just check that the data we got back was also cut off and it's not a display problem that I've made. Now that looks all correct. Let's compile it again. Okay, that all looks the same, but the correct ending was, and piece together the evidence to solve the case. I'm slightly surprised we got back the same identical message with just the correct ending. However, let's push forwards for now. Let's move all of this into its own script, and I want to include some of these debug messages still. So I've put all that into my copy buffer. Let's create a script when I can find it and give it a sensible name. Let's call it send GPT request. No, just send GPT. Let's paste that in, make the window a bit bigger so we can see, and let's get some proper indentation here. That's much better. So when I call this function, I want to supply one thing, just the question. I'm still going to have to store the request ID because I'm going to have to look for that in the async event. So let's initialize that in the create event. That could just start as 0, I guess. And now that I have that in a function, I could potentially run that from anywhere in my code. So now I'm going to want a new way to trigger it. Let's make a step event. This will run on every frame. And let's copy and paste this name over so I know it's correct. So let's say if keyboard check pressed virtual keyboard space, so if the user presses the space button, I want to then fire off the send GPT with the question. Let's grab that. Nope, not display string. Question to ask. Actually, remove it from there. I don't need it in the create event anymore. I'm just going to have it as a temporary variable. And let's randomize it so we just get some different questions being asked each time. Let's get some pretty spacing as well so it's easy to update in the future. Let's also ask it, what is the best game? And let's give it 3 questions. Say, do you like to play games? There we go. Need to put a bracket on the end of this. And let's make sure the random question that was selected actually gets passed into our function. And now we can give it a run. There is nothing running in the create event now, so I have to actively hit space to send the request. There is no single best game, as everyone has different tastes and preferences. What a good response. But now I can press space again, and new answer, press it again. New answer. That one's the game idea one again. Let's try again. Ah, yeah, and that one's for the last question. So, some of those responses looked very similar to each other. I think that's the next thing I want to try and improve. I don't even know if it's possible to change that because they might be being cached on the server side. However, that also doesn't make much sense because when it was listing best games, they were often similar but not identical. Okay, first thing to change, I just noticed this script was still untitled. Also, there's a big mistake here because int64 will make sure that's a whole number, but actually we want to allow decimal places. Let's also try reducing the temperature to see if that changes how repetitive the responses are. So it's compiled. Oh yeah, I've got to press space now. Well, this one's very different, but let's try another one. Again, this one mentions Grand Theft Auto and Minecraft. So does this one. It seems to be taking longer, but I don't know if that's just my imagination. So these have all been similar, but not identical. I guess that means reducing the temperature hasn't helped. Let's try bumping it up from 0.2 to 0.8. Actually, before I do that, I can just check the manual to see if they've got any advice on this. What sampling temperature to use? Between 0 and 2? Okay, so I can go all the way up to 2. Higher values like 0.8 will make the output more random. Well, that does seem like exactly what we want. I did put 0.8, however, this is all about experimenting for me, so we know what 0.2 looks like. Let's see what the other end of the spectrum looks like and try the full 2. Taking a long time to load. Wow, okay, got loads of text back. At first glance, that did look really good, especially at the start, but I'm trying to read it, and the further on it goes, the worse it gets. It looks like some weird lorem ipsum, where they're about the correct number of each letter and roughly the correct length of each word, and distribution of capital letters. However, when you start reading it, it's just gibberish. Okay, so now we know what it looks like when you set the temperature too high. Let's just put it as 1. Make sure it still works. Okay, we've got a font character that's missing, but that might be a problem on my end. Let's try another one. Okay, I mean, these are now all reasonably well worded and rational answers, so we'll keep that as 1. Now that we've removed int64 from temperature, I'm wondering if I should also remove it from max tokens. I might not have needed it in the first place, so let's see what happens now. I keep forgetting to press space. Okay, I get a crash. So it looks like it does need to be an integer. This seems like a good time to bring up error checking. You're going to have to put in some safety nets to make sure the format returned is in the format you expect. ChatGPT here has given me a sensible error message, but because it had a different layout, it's caused my end to crash. And I'm checking now. Yep, it says max tokens needs to be an integer and temperature is just a number or a float. Remember, this isn't a how-to guide, it's just me walking through, showing how I would approach integrating with a system like ChatGPT. Let's put the int64 back, and I can probably make max tokens a little smaller now that I know that it works. Let's give it another test, because I don't think we actually tested it with temperature set to 1. Loading. The answer to this question depends largely on personal preference and the type of game someone enjoys. Well, that's a rational answer. Now we know our system is robust enough so that if we send off a question, we'll get some form of coherent response. Let's have a go at asking it some more interesting questions. It's a bit self-referencing, but maybe asking ChatGPT for a good question is an interesting place to start. And we'll compile that. What is the best advice you can give me? Okay, well, that is a valid response to what I asked for, but it's far from interesting. How can I make the most of my free time? Okay, these are all a bit boring and safe. I want something that would allow it to stretch its abilities and show something that really looked like real intelligence. Just for funsies. It is a language model, so let's see if it can handle something silly like this. Is the curl command pronounced curl or curl? Whoops, let's spell that correctly. I don't quite know what I'm expecting here because it obviously can't audibly tell me what the answer is. Both pronunciations as curl and curl are accepted. That's probably right. That one just says curl. The curl command is usually pronounced curl, curl, curl. Okay, well, we've got a bit of a baseline for that. Let's actually see what happens if we change the temperature now. Let's try going down ever so slightly first. And compile that. Curl, curl, and curl. Okay, it strikes me that this might not have been great test data, but let's move it down to 0.2 first. Curl, curl. Okay, it always seems to be returning curl at this point. Let's try a number higher than 1, so 1.5. Curl. The curl command is typically pronounced curl. Curl again. The phrase curl is incorrect. Okay, interesting. The curl command is pronounced curl, not curl. So it might be a little bit more chatty now that it's been given a higher temperature. It seems to be using more words in its answer, more full sentences. I'm not really sure that taught us anything, but it was helpful to do anyway. I think the next thing to do to make it easier to send off different questions is let's have some buttons we can click on that dispatch a different message each. Let's give them a width and a height, so 200 by about 80 pixels seems right. The width and height will be the same for all buttons, but now I want to have some data to describe each of the individual buttons. Let's have an array for all this data, and each element inside the array will store the information about a single button. The information we want to store here is the text that is drawn on the button and what question gets dispatched when it is clicked. Let's just put a quick dummy question here like, is this working? Now let's duplicate this line 3 times with Ctrl D and update its array number and text so they're all unique. All of the questions are the same at the moment, but I'll think of some things to populate there while I'm typing out the draw code. And that's everything I need here. Oh, I actually need the start position of the button. Let's just put them on the left side of the screen and I'll make them quite low so they're underneath the text that we're getting at the moment. 400 pixels should be enough room. Okay, so we're actually going to need some code to display these buttons. Let's put a little comment in. So, how this will work is I'm going to loop around for each of those arrays, draw a button, and then walk along to where I want to draw the next button and repeat this for every button I need. Let's remind myself the name of the data. There we go. So this code is going to tell us how many buttons there are in total. Again, I'm just pressing Shift F4 to quickly type out a for loop for me. I need to set the colour of these buttons. We've got a black background and I know it's fairly garish, but let's just make these white. And then let's draw a rectangle. Now we need to know where to start drawing this rectangle. So I'm going to use 2 variables, running X and running Y. They can start off with our button start X and button start Y values. And then once I draw a button onto the screen, I'm just going to increase it by a certain amount. And that can be where I draw the next button. So let's draw the top left corner of our rectangle at this location. And then I'm going to use Ctrl D to duplicate part of a line. And then I want to draw the bottom right corner of the rectangle at its starting X position plus its width and its starting Y position plus its height. And I want this rectangle to be filled in, so let's put false here. Okay, so now I need some new variables that say how far along the next button should be. Let's call that button dist H and button dist V. And I want to move along the button width plus a 20 pixel margin. And let's do the vertical one, but for this I'm just going to leave it as 0. If I wanted to have these buttons spaced one below the next, I could say to give them a vertical gap, but for how I want them, I'm just going to list them all horizontally. And now it's very easy inside my loop just to increase the running X and Y values by the distance values. And make that the vertical distance. And I'm just checking to see if I've made any silly mistakes, but that looks fine. Let's give it a compile. And I've got my 3 rectangles being drawn. Let's just make them a little shorter and then we can add some text to them. They are currently 80 pixels. They don't need to be made shorter by much, so let's make them 65. And then we need to go back to drawing in black. See black. And then we can draw our text. I've already set the font and the alignment at the top of this script. And I just want to draw out button data. And then I just want to get the element that matches how many times this loop has run. And then from this, I just want to pull the text part of the data because that's where I stored the text that goes on the button. Let's make sure I draw this text at the middle of the button. So button width divided by 2 and button height divided by 2. And I've just realised that I do need to, in fact, reset the alignment because the text was being justified to the left side of the screen, but now I actually just want to center align it in the middle of the button. In the future, I may want a slightly smaller font on the buttons, so I'm going to do draw set font here, even though I'm not actually changing it to anything. And then we can just align it to the middle center. Okay, so now I've got that done. When I compile this, I'm expecting to see the 3 white boxes still, but with the button names drawn in the middle of each one in black. So let's give that a try. B1, B2, B3, perfect. Let's actually make it so something happens when you click on them now. I'm going to start off with this code we've got. Let's paste that into the step event. I want to get rid of anything that talks about the draw event. So all that can go. Actually, I'm just going to keep these values so I can copy and paste them into the point in rectangle I'm going to use later on. So if the mouse button is released, let's do the left mouse button. And if the mouse cursor is inside the rectangle, then let's grab the mouse position. And I already know the draw rectangle has the correct values in, so I'm going to copy that over. And let's just put a debug message if that actually works and the click is inside a button. Rather than actually putting any code behind it for the moment, I just want to check to make sure the clicks are happening correctly. So what I'm expecting when I compile now is if I click on the black screen, nothing should happen. But if I click on any of the white rectangles, yep, you can see in the output log, it's saying, yes, I'm working. And if I click on the black background, nothing's being posted. Perfect. I'm just going to take baby steps at the moment, and let's change the debug message to match the question for that button. So I can remove this fixed text, and I just want button data, which is an array, dot question. And let's give that a compile. Click this. Is this working? So they all say, is this working? Okay, but that's the correct data. I still need to replace these with real questions, but I'm fairly confident it's working. But I think I've pushed forwards and actually implement this send GPT. So rather than posting that text into the debug console, let's actually put it into that function. And then I can totally remove this old code that triggered it on keyboard press space. Okay, let's actually update the questions we're dispatching. It would be nice to ask it some things about programming, so The first one, let's ask it a question about GameMaker language. Can you write a for loop for me in GML? I'm also going to put GameMaker language at the end, just so there's no confusions. And let's make the title of this button just say GML. For the next question, let's ask it something about programming styles. So this might be a bit controversial, but what is better, snake case or camel case? And if you don't know what that is, it's basically, do you prefer to use capital letters or underscores in your variable names? Oops, let's actually give that a title. And then for our last question, let's ask it, explain to me what a while loop is. And give that one the title while. One advantage to the way I've put these buttons into an array is if I wanted to have a fifth or sixth button, I can just duplicate a line and the draw and step event will just run one extra time. I think this while loop question is a little bit easy, so let's also ask it what a shader is. I'm still trying to find a good point for what the temperature is. I mean, 1.5 is definitely too high. Let's just put it to 0.6 for now. So we have all the buttons with the correct titles. We'll click the first one. I mean, that certainly looks like valid code. All the semicolons are correct, correct brackets. Let's try the case statement. The answer to this question depends on the context and the intended use case. Snake case is generally better for programs and code, while camel case, and then it cuts off again. Last time I fixed that by just increasing the max token count. Let's try the while statement. We have the answer for the while loop, which generally looks fine. Let's try the shader one. A shader is a program used in computer graphics to determine the final colour of a pixel on the screen. It's used to calculate effects such... it's such a tease. I could fix it just dropping the end of sentences by increasing max tokens. However, I don't mind only seeing the start at the moment, and rather than seeing more text, we noticed the reply came in an array earlier, so I'm wondering if I can get it to give us many responses every time we ask it a question. Let's go back to the manual and see what other things we can play with. Prompt. So I've been calling that question. It says string or array, but maybe you can ask it many questions. Suffix that comes after a completion of inserted text. That's not interesting to us. Max tokens. This is the one that's been cutting off the end of the text. However, I've been using fairly small numbers because look, it accepts many thousands to be used. Temperature, we've already had a play with that one. Top P is an alternative to sampling with temperature. However, I'm actually quite content with where we have temperature set now. N, how many completions to generate for each prompt. This sounds like the value we can change if we want more than one answer to be returned in the response. It is expecting an optional integer, so I'll keep that in mind. Whether to stream back partial progress. Log probs. Include the log probabilities on the log prob's most likely tokens. That's a mouthful, but I think it's just talking about giving multiple replies. The next one's echo. Echo back the prompt in addition to the completion. Not helpful. Stop. This just ends the processing early. Presence penalty. Positive values penalise new tokens based on whether they appear in the text. This is how likely it is to mention new topics. Frequency penalty. This says the same thing, but it's about getting it to talk about the same topic. Best of. I'm happy with this being left as default because we're quite happy with it just returning the best answer it can come up with. Logit bias. This looks like a way we can manipulate the response to change what it contains. And the last one is user, which is just our unique ID, but it's optional, so I'm not going to mess with that. Okay, let's go back to the one titled N, because I think it would be quite fun to get many answers returned so we can compare them. Let's start by simply adding this extra data to the current ones we're sending. So let's put n:3. Oh, and it said it had to be a number, so let's wrap it in the int64 again. Okay, now that we're asking for more answers when we send off the request, we're going to need to write something to handle them when they're returned back to us. A while back, I remember putting in some code that said array 0, and the 0 was hard-coded. Back then, we were only getting a single answer returned, so we knew it'd be in the first entry, which has the ID 0. We're going to want to update that to just loop around and display all of the answers. However, first I want to check it works in a way I expect, and that it will arrive in this choices array with the indexes 0, 1 and 2. I'm going to copy all this code and still keep it hard-coded. I can tidy it up later and make it more dynamic, but just to get us started, I want to make sure each of these new responses returned are in one of those arrays I expect. I'm going to add a line break in between each one, so that's the /n. Whoops, put the slash the wrong way around. Okay, and with that done, I'm hoping we'll see multiple answers when we dispatch a question now. Let's do the case one. Okay, they're a little hard to read, but they are unique though. So let's move the buttons and give the text more room to move. So let's go to the draw event and update how wide the text can be before it flows onto a new line. It's set to 500 at the moment. I think 700 pixels wide should be fine. Yeah, looks about right. The button position is at 400. Let's just change that to 600. Add another 200 pixels. That seems fine. Actually, there probably is more room for text to go. 900 seems fine. Let's give that a compile and check out the while loop. Great, that's laid out very nicely. They're all similar, but none of them are identical. I think that this proof of concept has shown that the data is in the format that we wanted. So rather than using hard-coded numbers, I want to switch it to a loop that will list out all of the answers inside the reply. Let's get a preset loop, but we're actually already inside a loop, so I'm going to change all of these to say J. So how many times do we want to loop around for? Let's have a new temporary variable called number returned. And I want that to equal the number of elements inside full messages.choices. And let's paste over the variable. There we go. Now, every time that loop runs, I want these two lines to be executed. Let's copy them over. But rather than looking at the hard-coded 0, I want to put J in there. And that J will increase by 1 each time. So this time, I'm expecting to see the exact same thing we did last time. 3 responses, one above the other. But instead we get an error message. That's unexpected because most things were a copy and paste of before. It's telling me we tried to use full message before it was set. There it is with the red squiggle underline. It was just missing the underscore at the start. I'm sure many of you noticed that. Normally I copy and paste things over to avoid that exact mistake. Okay, we've run it again, but we're only getting 1 response, but I expected all 3 to be displayed. Oh, and here is the downside to copying things across without reading them. Each response I get is just overwriting the previous one. Now I've changed it to just append to the end of any other messages. Okay, now this time I'm expecting to see 3 results, one above each other. That looks pretty perfect to me. Okay, just to test that's actually working, let's change the number of responses we actually request. I need to go into the send GPT function, and it should be as simple as just changing the n number. I think I'm also going to move the buttons down a little, just to give us a bit more room to see things. 800 pixels should be fine. And let's give it a bit more horizontal width for the text. Oh, that's far from fine. I can't even see the buttons. Let's move them back up a bit. Let's just set this to a less drastic number. 700 should be fine. Okay, they're touching the bottom now, but that's still better than before. At least I can click them. Cool. 4 unique responses. They all seem quite logical and accurate. Okay, and I think that's a good place to draw a line under this example. I hope I've shown how easy it can be to connect to online services. If you are going to use it in one of your projects, I think you'd have to put a bunch more checks in to make sure the data is correct, or to handle if it can't connect and all those kind of things. Also, I'm not a network security expert. Injecting things from the internet right into your software may come with some serious downsides to avoid. Also, I should say with the nature of online things, it's likely to change going forwards. Normally companies are pretty good at supporting their APIs for a good period of time at least. However, if it gets changed or improved, I hope I've shown you the trail of thought I take so that you can update your code yourself. Thanks for getting all the way to the end. If you have any ideas for how you would use this, post them in the comments. Also, I want this to be a learning experience for me as well. If you have any ideas for how you would improve this, you can comment below, or I'm going to upload this whole project to GitHub, so you can just make the changes yourself so everyone can benefit. I'm David Strachan, thanks for watching.